In this video lecture, we will discuss professional roles and relationships in the behavioral health care context. Behavioral health care professionals can take on a variety of roles. We are focused on the counselor role in this class, and will continue to focus on that discipline in this lecture. I want to specifically talk about the counselor's role and relationship with individual clients, the counselor's role in group treatment with a number of clients, and the counselor's role in couples or family treatment, which is a special kind of group treatment. In addition, I want to talk about the roles and relationships that supervisors have with supervisees, as most behavioral health care professionals will serve in one of those capacities throughout their careers. Finally, I want to discuss multiple relationships, and in particular, the researcher versus therapist relationship and the personal versus professional relationships. Navigating these roles can sometimes be tricky, but all behavioral health care professionals need to master them if they're going to be successful. When a counselor is working with an individual client, there are a number of clients' rights issues that arise. We've covered these more broadly in previous modules, but I want to highlight the differences that might occur based upon the role a counselor plays. With informed consent, the elements remain the same. It must be knowledgeable, voluntary, and competent. In addition to the other substantive issues we've discussed in an earlier module, you may want to also include the type of treatment approach you intend to take, the limits of confidentiality, and your expectations regarding attendance, cancellations, and the therapeutic relationship. It is also incumbent on you as the counselor to maintain good records. You should not delegate your responsibility to someone else. You may want to keep process notes that you jot down when you're with the client, and then a more formal progress note after each session or encounter. Although you may address confidentiality in the consent process, you may want to emphasize that while you will generally keep things in confidence, there are some circumstances where you would need to break confidentiality, such as if the client were going to hurt him or herself, or hurt someone else, the client intends to commit a crime, or if there's an abuse or neglect issue that comes up. Additionally, if you're receiving supervision from a more senior clinician, you should let your client know that you'll be sharing information with that supervisor. Termination with an individual client usually takes on one of two forms. The first one is where the treatment has been successful and the client is moving on and not continuing with another clinician. In that instance, you may want to end by discussing the progress the client has made and the skills they have developed, and celebrate the ending of treatment with optimism. The second one is where you may need to transfer the client to another clinician to continue treatment. In this case, you should follow the process outlined in the last module, where you give clear notice to the client that your relationship is ending with them, then refer them to another competent clinician, and then cooperate with that new clinician. When working with children and adolescents, the situation is a bit more complex, because now you have a third party involved, that is, the parents or guardian. You will need to obtain consent from the parents or guardian, and then obtain assent from the child or adolescent. The most critical issue in this type of arrangement involves confidentiality. Oftentimes parents want to know what's going on in a child's sessions or treatment, but transparency and openness with parents can negatively impact the relationship and therapeutic alliance that you have with the child or adolescent. So it is critical in these kinds of arrangements to clarify confidentiality issues at the outset or start of the treatment process. Typically what's done is that the counselor informs the parents and the child that he or she will keep things in confidence with the child unless there is concern about the safety of the child or about something that could greatly impact the family. The counselor should let the child know that he or she may provide general information to the parents as to how things are going, but will avoid specifics, again, unless there's a concern about the safety of the child or something that could be a major issue for the family. The clinician should try to keep what the child says in confidence. Financial issues should also be covered up front in the treatment process. Typically, if the counselor is working for an agency, a business office will handle those sorts of issues. However, if the counselor is practicing independently, he or she may need to handle such financial issues him or herself. It can be done in the informed consent process. However, it may be better to do it as a separate process with a separate engagement letter establishing the cost of treatment and expectations about payment. Counselors also need to keep in mind how they will look to address situations where involuntary commitment may be necessary. You should think through what you might do if someone says they will hurt themselves or they might hurt someone else. You should have emergency numbers available for such situations. Finally, issues of malpractice could arise. You should absolutely have malpractice insurance, and keep in mind the principles that we talked about a few modules ago with regards to legal liability. In other words, be an ORP. Remember, if you are ever accused of malpractice, one of the first things a court will look to is your clinical record. So make sure your records are up to date and complete. When working with groups, the client rights issues are not too different from working with individuals. The informed consent process and content is fairly similar, except for confidentiality issues that we'll talk about in a second. You still need to maintain individual records, and just be sure to keep names of group members out of each other's records. You can use initials or codes or something else if you need to refer to another person. With regards to confidentiality, while you can emphasize to all group members to keep things in confidence, you cannot guarantee to any member that what they say will be kept private or in confidence. That's because you can't control what other people might say outside the session. So you should clarify with the entire group up front that you expect them to not talk about issues raised to people outside the group, but you should also never guarantee confidentiality. Financial issues are essentially the same as with individuals, and you should discuss such financial issues individually with each group member. Voluntary participation in a group is optimal, but not always possible. There are settings and situations where someone may be required to attend a group. How might you approach such a group differently? Well, you should be very clear about rights and responsibilities of attending the group, as well as the consequences of inappropriate behavior. With such groups, you may need to deal with the dynamics of the interpersonal situation instead of substantive issues, but sometimes those can be very instructive for members as well. If you search on Google for group techniques, you'll find many guides for group work on the internet. When working with groups, you should keep in mind, first, the focus is on the needs of the group and not on the facilitator. Sometimes counselors can lose that kind of perspective. Second, you should only use techniques that you're familiar with and that further a therapeutic purpose. If you're not familiar with the technique, then you should seek supervision by someone who is familiar with it before you try doing it on your own. Third, you should modify the techniques that you use based on group members' characteristics. Thus, you might base it on cultural or gender or venue characteristics. When ending or terminating a group process, you could approach it in several ways. If it's a closed group, that is a group that's dissolving when any member leaves, you may want to review the successes and things that have been learned over the course of the treatment. You may also want to discuss feelings of loss or abandonment that can occur when something important like this ends. In an open group, or a group where members come in and out of it, you may want to celebrate the gains of the person who's leaving. Reviewing the person's growth from the first session that they were in the group can not only help that person, but the entire group see the progress that's been made. Treatment with couples and families can be the most gratifying work, but it can also be the most intense and tension-filled treatment. Couples and family not only know each other, but typically live together. After this group finishes a session, they may be going home together. The client's rights issues are very similar to what occurs in general group relationships. You should be careful to clarify confidentiality issues and financial issues up front. That is, what information will you be sharing with other members of the family, and who is going to be paying for the process? Counselors need to be careful not to put their own views on how relationships should work onto the couple or family. They should be open to alternative ways of living and relating. If they can't do this, then they may need to transfer the clients to another counselor. Let's consider a case study. Marge and Al come to marriage counseling to work on the stress they're experiencing in rearing their two adolescent sons. The couple directs the focus towards what their sons are doing and not doing. In the course of therapy, the counselor learns that both Marge and Al have full-time jobs outside the home. In addition, Marge is a full-time mother and homemaker, but her husband refuses to share any domestic responsibilities. Marge doesn't question her dual career. Neither Marge nor Al shows much interest in exploring the division of responsibilities in their relationship. Instead, they focus the sessions on getting advice about how to handle problems with their sons. What would you do with the presenting problem? That is, the trouble with their sons. What might the behavior of the sons imply? Is it ethical for the therapist to focus only on the expressed concerns of Marge or Al, or does the therapist have a responsibility to challenge this couple to look at how they have defined themselves in the relationship through assumptions about gender roles? So how would your interventions reflect your values in this case? Those are a lot of questions that you really need to consider if you were ever to have a case like this, because this is a fairly common dilemma. The parents have little time for the children, and yet the children are seen as the problem. This case illustrates how critical it is for counselors to be aware of their values pertaining to gender, as well as their own gender biases. You may want to explore how satisfied the couple lives with the division of labor and their own relationship with each other before you start delving into the issues with their sons. If you pursue a career as a behavioral health care professional, you will be at some point a supervisee, that is, someone who gets supervised, particularly early in your career. Or you might be a supervisor, and sometimes both at the same time. Supervisors serve a variety of roles, including that of mentor or teacher, or they might be a consultant or an advisor for a specific issue, or they could serve a legal or ethical role in the informed consent or confidentiality process, or when liability is a concern. In general, though, supervisors in the behavioral healthcare context often serve as role models as to how a clinician effectively does their job with integrity. There are a variety of ways in which a supervisor may oversee what a supervisee is doing. First, the supervisee might just tell the supervisor what they're doing in treatment sessions or assessments. In other words, self-report to the supervisor. Second, the supervisee might write progress notes that the supervisor can read through before mentoring the supervisee. Third, the supervisee might audio or video record treatment or assessment sessions with clients that can then be viewed together with the supervisor to receive feedback. Fourth, the supervisor could actually attend treatment or assessment sessions to observe what the supervisee does and to provide appropriate feedback based on those observations. And finally, the supervisee might be part of a group supervision session with the supervisor, where other supervisees discuss what they're doing and they can learn from each other as well as from the supervisor. Each of these methods can be effective in helping the supervisee learn his or her craft, but self-report is the most common method used. So what about a personal relationship between the supervisor and supervisee? How casual or personal should a supervisee be with their supervisor? My advice is to make sure that the professional boundaries are clear. While there can be informal interactions between supervisors and supervisees, such as attending a happy hour or a group celebration, professional boundaries should still be maintained. If the personal relationship overshadows the professional relationship, legal complexities and potential liabilities increase. So just be careful. A number of other complexities can arise when multiple roles or relationships are involved. For example, when a therapist is also conducting research, like a survey with his or her clients, it is critical that the distinction between what is treatment and what is research is made. We discussed this in an earlier module, and you may recall that the Declaration of Helsinki mandates that this distinction and clarification be made. It should also be made during the informed consent process. It is critical to inform your client what role you have with them. Just as you can have personal versus professional roles in the supervisor-supervisee relationship, you can have such personal versus professional role confusion between a counselor and a client. The key is to maintain your objectivity. Should you treat or have clinical sessions with the family and friends? In general, you probably shouldn't be in a professional role with family and friends because it's too difficult to separate out the multiple relationships in play. In some small communities, however, as I'll talk about in a moment, it's difficult to avoid such multiple roles. You may be the only behavioral health care professional in the community, and thus you may need to work with people you know in more personal contexts. If that happens, then you need to clearly change hats and let the client know which hat you have on when you're interacting with them. That is, do you have your therapist hat on, or do you have your personal friend hat on? What about social media? Can you friend a client on Facebook? The American Counseling Association Ethics Code prohibits such social media relationships. What you may want to do is create professional social media accounts that are separate from your personal social media accounts. So you would have a Facebook page for your clinical practice and a separate one for your personal relationships, such as family and friends. What about sexual relationships? Should you have sex with a client? The answer is no, never. You should never have sex with a current client. Attorneys receive a lot of business in this area, and you don't need to be on the receiving end of a lawsuit. What about former clients? Can you have sex with former clients? Most professional association ethics codes say that you can have sex with former clients after a certain number of years. For example, the American Psychological Association allows you to have sex with a former client after 2 years of them not being your client. The American Counseling Association says you can do it after 5 years. The American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists after 2 years. And for rehabilitation counseling, it's 5 years. The National Association of Social Work says you should never have sex with former clients. However, then it goes on to state the burden is on the social worker to show that it's not harmful, which confuses their ban on sex. My advice is to avoid mixing sex and professional pursuits at any time. So I definitely would avoid any sort of sexual relationship with a current or former client. Many professional associations disagree with my view, however, and as noted before, in small communities it can be much more difficult to avoid such multiple roles. So what if a client starts giving you gifts? Small gifts may be okay and could serve a therapeutic purpose, but I would avoid accepting any gifts of significant value, because that can cloud the professional relationship you have with your client. Again, the focus should be on the therapeutic needs of the client. What if your client is short of money to pay for your services and offers something else in exchange, like an item of value? For example, maybe a farmer offers you a pig in exchange for 10 therapy sessions. This is called bartering. The key with bartering is to make sure that it's not exploitive and that the terms are clear. You should always put such arrangements in writing, including what is being exchanged for what. As long as the bartering arrangement is kept fairly simple and clear, it may be a useful alternative to direct payment in some situations and may enable you to help a client who you couldn't help otherwise. This concludes this video lecture on professional roles and relationships in behavioral health care.